Hello my dear friends, how are you? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. Welcome, I'm Arith and today I would like to briefly explore a certain animistic perception on the god Thor as a weather god. Well, this is the 500th video in this channel and I wanted to do something special and no lack of imagination or ideas, just lack of time, so I leave other videos, other special videos for another time, and I would like to have sort of just a little chat about this, right? I'm currently reading this book right here. I'm not sure if you are familiar with it. I can't yet say if it's a good book or not, as I've only read 14 pages. I've stopped at the first chapter, which is no more than 5 pages, because I found this particular subject to be quite interesting and more or less goes in line with what I've been saying about Thor for quite some time now. Nowadays, among neo-pagans, let's say more inclined to the Nordic gods, and among heathens, modern heathens, I've always found it rather strange, a great focus, or a greater focus on the god Odin and not so much on Thor. But I do get that modern appreciation for a god that was once quite popular among the Scandinavian nobility. So much so that, naturally, Odin is the Nordic deity most talked about in the surviving written sources, and much of the literary works are of Icelandic medieval compositions, which focuses quite a lot on Odin through a progressive development of religious syncretism through the Christian lens, turning Odin into the equivalent of the monotheistic Abrahamic god as a sky deity. So, usually people coming from an Abrahamic religious background, especially for us, let's say in Europe, from a Christian background, and shifting into a neo-pagan perception focused on the Nordic gods, well, we will naturally cling on to Odin as it is the deity most similar to the previously familiar Christian god, right? So no worries, I've been there too many years ago when taking my first steps into paganism and more inclined to the Nordic deities as well. Gods, over 20 years ago. Well, but even focusing on the pre-Christian religious perception of Odin, it's still rather strange. Neo-pagans and modern heathens having so much focus on this deity, because despite Odin being a fascinating deity, there's no doubt, there's no dispute, surely, and obviously also in a relentless pursuit for knowledge and god of wisdom and magic, which is great, it's actually, Odin is actually rarely portrayed as a benefic deity. In fact, it's usually portrayed as a cruel and selfish deity whose quest for knowledge is solely self-serving and to expand its own power, to establish, reinforce, and secure its rulership, because it was a deity of royalty, of nobility, right? Besides, Odin does give some blessings, surely, but not without terrible consequences. In the sources, at least, everyone who follows the pagan Odin is gifted with wonderful things and powers, great, but always ends up in some misfortune. And in the best case scenario, death is Odin's final gift. Odin ultimately gets what he wants, and that is the spirits of the dead. Odin is a god of death. And even his solo quest for wisdom and power is surrounded by death. Either the death of others who become victims of Odin's quest for knowledge, or he is surrounded by the dead, which he has the power to both awake them and to bring them to the afterlife. Much of Odin's own magic is, in all aspects, necromancy, in the most original sense of the word, mind you, to communicate with the spirits of the dead for prophetic reasons. Augury through the dead, right? And mind you, I'm not saying that Odin isn't worth the trouble, let's say, and to the most curious and those who ran solo on their quest for knowledge, Odin is indeed a fascinating and fantastic deity to work with. And now picking a little bit from personal gnosis as well. Anyway, what I find it strange is the modern appreciation for Odin, which is massive. That's strange, because Odin truly isn't for everyone. And that's fine, because there's just a lot of things concerning magic, the occult, religious philosophies, spirituality in general, etc., that it's just not for everybody, and that's fine. Now, Thor, on the other hand, nowadays is also quite popular. but usually because we live in a highly consumerist society. Thor became quite famous because nowadays, because of Marvel or through Marvel and because of metal bands. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, is used by many and a great number of people. It's simply because it has become a fashionable piece of jewelry, especially in the metal scene and through the metal scene. So basically, these days, Thor's fame and reputation comes through capitalism. Thor is the god of capitalism now. However, historically speaking, Thor was indeed one of the most famous and revered gods of late Scandinavian Iron Age and Nordic early Middle Ages, because he was the god of the people, the god of the great majority of the population, farmers. Thor was a farmer's deity. However, not enough credit is given to Thor, even among neo-pagans and modern heathens. And perhaps that has to do with the sources themselves, the literary sources at least. Despite having been a loved god by many in the past, we must not forget that much of the surviving written sources were created to highlight the religious perception and belief systems of the elite. But the elite was quite aware of how Thor was a beloved god among the people they ruled, and it was essential to maintain Thor in the stories to keep the population happy. Because through mythology in an orally society, the stories of the gods not only express cultural aspects and the human perception and how the human interacts with the land and how that affects daily life, but these stories were also a means to convey the religion of the elite, to express and reinforce their power over the populace. When nobility speaks to their subjects to reinforce their rulership over them through the myths, it is of the utmost importance to include the beloved deities and heroes, cultural heroes of the population, so they can have this false sense of inclusion, when in fact it is with the objective to paint a picture of the illusion of worth of the population and their work, which in fact it's just a means to secure the power of the elite by keeping the subjects happy and blind with a false sense of belonging, and also how their hard work is important in the great scheme of all things. But the truth is just that the elite wants to maintain their subjects in a constant hardship and daily work, subjugated to their power and to ever aggrandize their power, becoming wealthier at the expense of the hard work and hardship of the people. However, calm down. Not everything about the gods, as shown in the myths, is about the deceiving politics of the elite. Surely not. There's plenty of content which is a more, let's say, elaborated expression of the animistic mind of pre-Christian peoples. And that is true in the Norse myths as well, including in the figure of Thor. That's what we are here for. Thor's appreciation these days obviously isn't the same as before, which is rather sad, in my opinion, as someone whose spiritual path is more turned to an animistic perception, let's say. As much as it is possible, of course, for a non-indigenous modern person such as myself. Please, watch this video. Now, Thor is usually portrayed as a brutish oaf, which isn't strange at all, as Thor was a farmer's god, and that is indeed how he is portrayed quite often in the literary sources, as a literal portrayal of farmers through the perception of those who ruled them. Thor appears as a rather rude, brutish, peasant-like, impulsive, block-headed, yet strong and robust, fierce half-giant. I mean, the stereotypical portrayal of farmers and other country dwellers. But if we look into the animistic perception behind Thor, Thor's whole character, adventures, and general portrayal of his character paint a very different picture of who this deity was for the farmers themselves, and why he was the most beloved deity among the people of the countryside. As spoken here before on other videos, of course, Thor was not a warrior's god. Thor was not a god of war. Thor was, without a doubt, a farmer's god. And through the lens of the daily life of a farmer, we begin to understand Thor's importance as a deity, as a divine force, a spirit entity. As spoken here before, Thor was the thunder person. In an animistic perception, this is the entity, the personhood of thunder itself, as a force, as a spirit, as an entity residing in the world. Thor is a weather entity whose existence is fundamental, not just for farmers, but as a whole, as a force existing in the world, capable of both creation and destruction, provider of fertility and provider of great disasters that change the landscape. In an animistic perception, the thunder person is an entity that can be seen and whose manifested actions are seen in the natural landscape. Much of what we see in animistic belief systems and animistic mythologies is precisely an expression of the human person's engagement with the landscape and its own perception towards the landscape and its inhabitants. Now, let me briefly highlight a few of Thor's important aspects that have been spoken here before, in more depth in other videos in this channel, of course. To begin with, Thor is a half-giant, right? Giants in Norse myths are usually the portrayal of the forces of nature or natural forces, be those cosmic forces, primeval forces, or entities of both weather and landscape features. Giants are the earth in its totality, the landscape and the weather. Thor's condition as half-giant gives him the opportunity to be a divine figure whose power has great influence over the earth and its inhabitants, particularly towards the weather, the atmosphere, and the fertility of the earth, because Thor is the thunder person, a weather god, a storm god, to be more precise. And storm gods, in most mythologies, bring the rains, and therefore are usually linked to rivers, streams, water in general, and both the fertility of the earth, by extent the creation of life, as well as the destruction of the landscape through storms and everything that involves such weather phenomena. From the point of view of animism towards the thunder person, this divine force in the world is essential to provide sustenance as well as to provide change. The visual impact alone of a great storm is enough to see it as a powerful force of divine nature, which humans have little control over, even nowadays with weather satellites. The power of the thunder person is quite unpredictable, and it can be a great blessing or a great force of change, which can also be a blessing to some and the ultimate damnation to others. Furthermore, we have the theme of Thor fighting the world serpent, the Midgard serpent Jormungandr. As spoken here many times before, and with bibliographical sources to prove this point on several other videos, Thor's fight and or interaction with the great world serpent is usually misinterpreted as good versus evil. Jormungandr, as the name indicates, it is the mighty Gandr, that is the mighty spirit, the primordial force of creation and the vital force of the earth, expressed in the animistic conception of the serpent. Jormungandr is the very telluric energy or force of the earth, and often portrayed as the protective shield of the earth itself. Thor, as a weather god and god of thunder and rain, in this dance with the great serpent, portrays the interaction between the thunder person with the very vital force of the earth. This is a theme of sexuality, a theme of fertility, fecundity, creation. The rain and the thunder and other elements of storm that provide life by the contact with the soils of this world. Get this in mind, right, as it will be useful further ahead. Now, given this, it's no wonder that Thor is the only god in Norse myths, the only deity, the only divine force that can freely walk between the realm of the divine and the realm of humanity. So surely some of you might be thinking that Odin and Loki can do the exact same thing. However, Loki was not portrayed or was not perceived as a deity, but instead as a trickster spirit, which makes all the difference, and no less important in the scheme of all things, including as the person that challenges the divine plans. And Odin requires several disguises and shape-shifting and artifacts that help him to wander about. Now, Thor is the only Nordic deity that can freely pass between the realms of the divine and the realms of humanity, between the natural world and the world of the gods. Usually the only thing required of Thor to shift between realities is to cross a river. There it is, the association between weather gods, storm gods, and rivers as divine powers, providers of water. There are no boundaries for Thor, as not only he frequently walks between this world and the world of the divine, but he also enters the world of giants, for he himself is a giant. He is a force of nature, atmosphere god, storm god. So, it comes to no surprise the story of Thor and Loki coming together into the world of humans and visiting a farm and having a meal with farmers in their own farmstead. We have Thor and Loki, respectfully, the weather god beloved to farmers, who brings down the rains and whose dance with the vital force of the earth brings about fertility of the soils, and Loki, the Arith spirit, the spirit of heat and summer, essential in the daily domestic life, as well as a helping spirit to farmers during summer harvests. The importance of Thor and Loki in an agrarian animistic perception is portrayed in the account of Thor and Loki sharing a meal with farmers, literally being invited into their house and even taking human children with them as servants. So, with this being said, this is when this book comes in, sort of. The point being made here is that a sky god is not the same thing as a storm god. And that is essential to understand, to differentiate between the two, to better understand the mythological content, as well as the religious metaphors and the animistic belief systems around such deities. Not all sky gods are weather gods, storm gods, but many weather gods can become sky gods eventually, although they do not start as such, right? This is crucial to understand, especially when we take to the studies of Norse mythology and Icelandic medieval literature in the of the Nordic gods, to understand the difference between Odin and Thor and their popularity and why, and what is the pagan and animistic understanding behind them. Sky gods are literally related to the sky. They are not the storm, they are not the wind, they are not weather phenomenon. Sky gods are the sky itself and can also be stars, heavenly bodies, such as the sun and the moon, sky phenomena. They do not have a particular visible expression when it comes to the human perception of the natural landscape. A visible expression that is actually manifested in a way that can be felt and touched and has an active expression. The sun gives light, the stars shine, but weather, on the other hand, thunder, rain, clouds, mists, wind, those have an active expression, often visible, with very visible and active manifestations that have a real visual impact and consequences on people's lives and on the landscape. The divine force of the sun, under the category of sky gods, doesn't have an active, visible, immediate manifestation in the landscape. The divine force of thunder, under the category of weather gods or storm gods, has an active, visible and immediate manifestation on the landscape through visual and audible and even sensorial impact, as well as the rains, the wind, the storms with all their beauty and fury. Storm deities are deities of the earth, of the atmosphere of the earth. They are the weather persons, the phenomenon of this world, which brings about a closer interaction with them. whilst sky gods have a distance to themselves. They are distant and not of this world, not of this atmosphere. And the human expression towards them is not as actively and more eagerly expressed as it is towards weather deities. Sky gods are not elemental in an active human interaction with the landscape. Sky gods are not the wind, they are not the rain, they are not the sands. There's this detachment from the earth. Storm gods, on the other hand, can be interacted with through the rain, the wind, the sands. Storm gods are gods of the earth, of the atmosphere of the earth. They are the weather of the earth, the phenomenon of the earth, which has visual impact upon the landscape and an active and effective behavior with Earth's living inhabitants. This, in an animistic perception, creates a spiritual distancing between humans and sky deities, and the spiritual closeness between humans and storm or weather deities. The great importance of storm gods in the spiritual sense may eventually turn them into sky gods, surely, but they do not start as such, and start instead as powerful persons of the earth, gods of the earth. Now, Thor is a storm god, and what was previously said helps to understand his great importance among farmers. The weather god whose power, action, and expressions are visible and effective in the human interaction towards the landscape, as well as a clear impact upon the lives of humans, as a force provider of fertility as well as chaos, in an agrarian animistic perception. Now, I'm picking Thor for this because in this channel most of you are more familiar with my work on Nordic and Viking studies. But I could pick any storm god and the pattern would be the same or very similar, because ultimately human beings are very visual creatures. We are. And the more something is manifested in a visual manner that can be immediately perceptible, the more impact it has on the way the human person interacts with the world that surrounds it, and hence the more impact on a spiritual, religious level, because ultimately belief systems start off as people's interactions with the natural world, what can be immediately perceptible. Now, the case expressed in this book is rather interesting. Now, finally, let us speak of this particular short chapter. The author states something quite interesting, that storm gods don't just come from the sky, reinforcing their existence as deities of the world instead of the visual and perceptual distance that sky deities have. She states that storm gods also come from the underground, the underworld. This can immediately make sense given what was previously expressed concerning Thor as god provider of fertility of the earth, creator of rivers, the very effective and active impact of storms upon the earth, upon the soils, and the very soils of this world. Things grow out of the underground and waters ultimately go down into the earth and back into the sky, into the atmosphere, in this constant cycle. But she goes further than this, picking on the research of cloud formation and rainfalls. One of the drivers behind rainfall are fungal spores, fungi that produces mushrooms, which grow from the earth and thus come into the surface. Mushrooms eject spores with a tremendous force, some landing far from the original mushroom, but most are lifted upwards by the wind into the sky. Millions of spores enter the atmosphere every year. Some of these spores will land in the dirt and begin to root in the underground. But many millions more travel great distance through the air for weeks, following the wind, generating rain. Sugars on the spore's surface cause water to condense around them. Spores become a nucleus in floating water molecule. These spores full of water bump into each other many times until they accumulate into rain clouds. Spores create atmosphere, particularly atmospheres high in humidity. Fungi need damp environments in order to fruit into reproducing mushrooms. These mushrooms, on the other hand, release billions of spores that create clouds. The clouds in turn drop rain down into these environments, creating the perfect mushroom conditions, and so on and so forth. The cycle continues. In other words, mushrooms create rain clouds. And the author makes an important point. Given this fact, when we harm the soils, we ultimately harm the skies or the atmosphere. We destroy mushrooms, we destroy rain clouds, therefore no rain to feed the earth. Given this, a big percentage of water doesn't come from the sky, but from the underground through fungi. In this way, storm deities are underground deities, underworld deities. They start off from the underground up into the sky. Thor is a mushroom god, in a nutshell. Thor is ultimately an underworld deity. I doubt, of course, that there was this perception in the past, as we know, now we know this through science, but given that spores create rain clouds, storm deities are very much deities of the earth, of this world, of the atmosphere, and not the distant sky, because mushroom spores create rain clouds. Thus, storm deities are underworld deities, in the sense of underground phenomenon that ultimately leads to the creation of storms. And I think this is a good example that science isn't necessarily to express what is true, but instead it explains the truth. Through science, we have a better understanding on how the natural world works and how best to interact with it in order to preserve nature, which ultimately preserves life and preserves ourselves. Turning this into an animistic perception of life and picking on the deity Thor, and could just as well be any other storm deity, we start to see these storm deities as persons of the earth, of the world, of the atmosphere of this world, and very much of the ground as well, the underworld, the existence beneath our feet, from which life is manifested into the sky, into the atmosphere, and back to us, in a cycle whose preservation and protection is key to the survival of the species. Animism is, as Graham Harvey puts it in a nutshell, of course, respecting the living world. And this case of storm deities, or rather storm persons, as also persons of the underground, expands our knowledge of the cycles of nature, which helps us to extend our respect towards the living world. Storm deities give us rain, but water from the skies originates in the earth itself, in the underworld. Storm deities are underworld deities. Storm deities are mushroom deities. Thor is a mushroom deity. But makes a lot more sense being an earth deity, an atmosphere deity, a divine force of the world, right? And perhaps now it makes a little bit more sense, Thor's interaction with the world serpent and the vital force of the earth, and Thor's condition as half giant, having divine, being divine and half force of nature. The thunder person, the storm person, interacting with the vital force of the earth, because such a person is born of the earth. And perhaps it's no coincidence that Thor's mother is Jord, the personification of the earth itself, and Thor's interaction with the world serpent is Thor's interaction with the vital force of the earth. In other words, with the spirit of his own mother. It is the spirit of Thor's mother. My dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I truly hope it was useful somehow, hopefully to give a different perception towards our natural world and its weather phenomenon. And even if this isn't enough to get people into animism, at the very least, may this help to build up more respect towards the living world and its persons. Also, next week's video will be on Friday. It makes sense to me. It's a special video. My dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again. My dear friends, by the way, the book is The Flowering Wand. I've probably put a picture on the screen so for you to see, by Sophie Strand. As I said, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine. Interesting. As I've said, I've only read 14 pages, literally just 14 pages, so I'm not sure if it's worth the reading, but so far it is. This particular chapter, it is the first chapter, just 5 pages, was very, very interesting. That's it.